Call this Land Use Committee meeting to order January 18th, 7:30 a.m.
First item
is discussion of parking at the Port Orchard Industrial Center and code 10.12, parking, standing and stopping.
So
Sorry, Mark.
pretty much every year, every other year, the city updates 10.12 through an ordinance due to changes throughout the city. The current change that I was working on initially was parking changes associated with 720 Prospect, to take two of those parking stalls that are currently, now I think they're 4 hour, whatever the downtown is, either 4 or 2, and changing those to, I think we're gonna do 1 hour, so for the permit center. And so that was something that we were gonna take to the council in January. But then another situation came up that warranted a pause, and that is, obviously with the economic upturn, the industrial park is seeing more growth. Some of those pads or vacant buildings are filling. And so when you go into Lloyd Parkway and you take that first left past RV, and then right by the work release, you turn north, take a right, that building there, that they now have tenants. And so they had called to ask if they could, or it was going to be leased, and then so the realtor said, hey, you know, can we basically do a lease agreement where they park on the street? And I said, well, no, because you're required to provide off-street parking. But then he said, yeah, but as you go past that building and take that first left on Lumsden Road, those businesses up there, they've got so many employees now that they're all parking out on the road. So he's like, well, if they can do it, why can't we? Type of thing. I said, well, you're not supposed to, you know, you're supposed to provide off-street parking. So the issue we have is there was never any, when this was originally platted in 1990-ish, 94, 95, the commercial subdivision didn't have any restrictions established because it was never designed or intended to have parking on the street. So this is just an opportunity to reconsider if we want to either just post no parking so that it's clear, which would require a change to 10.12 because again there is no signage out there, or to allow parking. I would hesitate to provide on-street parking simply because of the width of the road and the commercial nature of the facility. So it's going to be a bit of a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, you want to be supportive of the business, but on the other one, if people are parking on the street, obviously when these commercial pads were developed, they underparked their site. So luckily for me, I don't make policy.
So have they explored a parking agreement with some of the other vacant sites?
No.
And that's often a tool in the tool bag for people who don't have on-site parking. They explore off-site parking through an agreement with a neighboring vacant parcel or a church parking lot, for example, you know, in that kind of situation.
But that's a private matter.
Right.
When we go out and suddenly put up a notice saying, hey, you know, you can't park on the street.
Right.
They're going to have to explore those opportunities.
Right.
The issue for the city is, do we take a road section that was never intended to have on-street parking and is supposed to carry large trucks and suddenly allow parking on the street, which in this particular case isn't going to be business friendly. But I think it's what we have to do. There's another thing that's happening, that will be happening, is if you go to the Work Release Center and you can see the Lloyd Parkway to the west there, what I would say is the unopened Lloyd Parkway. RV Associates has a mining easement. That's all city property, this big block here. And so they've got a mining agreement with the city, which started here, and what they're doing is as they mine, they're creating commercial paths. And so they're coming in, we've met with them once, they're gonna propose to purchase a certain amount of this for continued mining, and then so these lower lots will then, just like these were at one time, will become commercial lots. That means that this road, Lloyd Parkway, I lost my bearings here. Right here, this Lloyd Parkway will get constructed, and then when we met initially, the initial conversation was that a road would be constructed by them into our area so that we can abandon potentially or loop through and deal with the Errol Dow situation. You know, how does he get to his property on the backside of the ravine? And so we're trying to work cooperatively to come up with a win-win situation. But once this is connected through, down here and up here, there's gonna be a lot of activity there. And to restrict any of those roads, I think it's not prudent.
My observation, and maybe you guys can weigh in, staff can weigh in, whenever we're in a situation that somebody needs some parking relief and they ask for on-street and we have said no, they always make it work somehow. Through
Yeah.
off-street or off-site parking agreements or reconfiguring.
Carpooling.
Yeah,
ride sharing.
employee parking is off-site perhaps, those kinds of things.
Right.
Well, and another observation here, if you look at if you can see the very faint parcel line, and assuming that's reasonably accurate, it seems to me that the pavement ends before the property line begins, and so if somebody wanted on-street parking, is there an opportunity for them to construct an actual parking lane rather than just putting the parking within the existing pavement width itself?
You were talking about like
On the southern
south
edge.
side of
On
Lumsden Road.
that inner ring,
Right.
there's potentially additional width there that could be constructed as roadway, but
Well, it would be, I mean, I guess the issue there is, so obviously these property lines, there's a building setback for the buildings.
I'm not talking about constructing on the lots. The setback is from the lot line to the building.
Right.
So if there is space between the pavement and the property line, is that being fully utilized? I guess.
So you're talking about that tiny little,
Yeah.
that's a conveyance ditch. That little teeny.
What's this up here in the far corner?
That, up in the far corner, that's, let's see, that's Ferguson in the green, and then that's their kind of warehouse.
Are we looking at, is this parking? Is this concrete?
That's their storage yard
Oh, okay.
for water pipes, and they're actually considering, the city has actually looked at purchasing that, like right across that line
Mm-hmm.
for the expansion of the shop. There's been some initial
Where's
conversation.
our shop?
The shop is
Green roofs.
just these two green roofs up
green
in the
roofs.
corner. So,
Well, I think it's a bad policy call to allow on-street parking.
right, and again, it was designed and approved to not have on-street
When
parking.
was
and
this, do you have any idea when this was taken?
This aerial?
Uh-huh.
I know when it was printed.
It's probably less than 3 years old.
Probably less than 3 years old, because when I look at it, most of those buildings have quite a bit of parking around them. So are they using them? I know that Air Masters recently went out there and they have a lot of trucks, and I don't know which building they're in.
Yeah, the issue right now, these are the people that think that they have a parking problem because they're looking at leasing the building or buying the building. It's whatever's going on in here, because when you drive up here and you look up this road, there's probably, every time I go up, there's at least 8 to 10 cars out on the street, and they're on both sides of the road. So you basically have very little room to get through.
Yeah, no, I'm in concurrence with Scott in that I don't think an on-street parking is appropriate.
Right. So the issue here is the city would have two options. One is you'd go out and you just stripe it with a fog line, or we do the code, because if a car is parked on the fog line, then the police can enforce it. So it may be easier just to go out and stripe the road as it was intended and not have to change 10.12 and start putting up signs.
I agree.
Yeah, it just doesn't look like they've explored, or doesn't sound like they've explored all the options.
No, I think they're just out there and they're in an industrial park and it's
Sure.
not been an issue. But now that the one guy has specifically asked and he's pointed to the other business.
Right, and that's the easiest solution, so why wouldn't you ask for that first?
Right. So, yeah, okay. So I think I'll get with Mark Fournier and we'll discuss the merits of signing. Do we think that's a better option, you know, information-wise, dissemination, or do we just go ahead with putting it on our striping for 2017? Add that.
Okay,
Okay?
Before we move on from this, Mark had mentioned the Errol Dowell property and the possibility of bringing a road through here. And that caused me to have a bit of a flashback, and I feel like I had Jim work on an analysis of that road, and I don't know if he ever presented that to you, but I think he determined that that would be a 12% grade minimum to get from point A to point B through the city property there.
Where's his property?
It's along Old Clifton, but we talked about it here in probably October or September, and
Yeah, I
it's
know, I
divided by
missed
a
the
creek, and so half the property fronts Old Clifton, and then there's a ravine that's like 50 or 60 feet deep with a creek, and then the other half has access off of Anderson Hill,
Right.
but it's a private residential road accessing industrial properties in the city. And so the private road owners won't give permission for commercial access to those properties, and we brought forward this issue and said, hey, you know, we have an ownership issue here where people aren't able to use their property because it's either going to require a bridge to access these few properties, or convincing these other owners to allow commercial traffic to come through their residential road, which isn't really going to happen. And then I think John Clausen, who was sitting in for you, suggested bringing a road from the industrial park over the city's property.
How far south is his property?
Errol Dow's?
Uh-huh.
Errol Dow's property just starts right about down here, just past the juvenile center.
Okay, and it goes across, does it go across like on the other side to Hanson Road? Off of Anderson Hill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is, I would say, it's probably 400 feet off the bottom of the page here based on this scale is where his properties start. But he has a checkerboard of ownership. They created 20 or so parcels, and one guy owns a few and plans on dying and passing this industrial property to his kids. He doesn't want to sell, rezone, or anything, and so Errol Dahl is sort of stuck because you either need to rezone everything or not rezone everything. And so we brought it forward as, hey, does the city want to initiate something other than industrial in this area because there's a lack of access? And
Right, and he's been before the council a couple of different times on that logging issue where he was going to do a conversion to take trees, and then he was just going to build houses, but then he was going to have to get a rezone because it's industrial. And so we've had a number of meetings with Errol over the years on just trying to figure out how he's going to develop that property with all of its challenges. And the real, kind of the only viable option at this point, because the city obviously doesn't want to give up industrial land, is to look at this point, the synergy that's happening between his issue and trying to get to his backside of the property, and also the fact that RV is basically willing, as part of the sale of this, a portion of this, the north portion of this property, is willing to construct that road. And they've done some initial designs on of that road and feel like they can build an adequate road.
Okay, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, we met with them, they came in a month and a half ago or something, so.
And we had actually talked about extending our existing road that goes up to the
Camp facility.
camp facility and going up from there, and so the grade may be different from that point versus going through the quarry area.
Right, they feel they could get up through here. There's another issue that's out there just for informational update, I guess, is, so this property, so the city owns, Casco is leasing this area, and then to the north that's Kitsap Transit. So this is the property line, and it goes back up. And when Carol was here, she let us know that we can't lease the way we're leasing. It's just one big property, and we, you know, what the city's done historically is they've kind of created a description. And basically, it's on our task list to take this parcel and do a short plat and actually create lots so that they could be sold or leased. So the city has to go through that process anyway, because we have Kitsap Transit, Casco, and we also have Northwest Tree Service that are all using that. And then we have the camp facility, obviously, the sweeper pad. So that's a project that's on the city docket to deal with in the future, and that will include extending the road up to get up to the police firing range, which is, you know, you can see this, that's a police storage building for evidence, and then their firing range is just past that a little bit. So there's a number of things that need to occur in this area, and so we're looking at trying to find a solution for all of it. And really the RV offer is pretty well timed. So at this point, like I said, I'll get with Mark and we'll look at what is really our most effective means to communicate no on-street parking, either striping or signage. And if it's signage, then I'll add it to 10.12.
Okay, item number 2, Tacoma Residential Infill Program.
So, I guess, I apologize for being late. I was hydroplaning all the way home from the meeting last night and to work this morning, so it was slow going, but,
Speaking of hydroplaning, I probably need to,
get a head
Hydroplane.
start.
Check in.
well, we've already got some flooding issues, so
Good luck.
thank you.
So this was something that I shared with the mayor. Obviously, I'm a Tacoma resident, and I recently found out about this program because I was hoping to build an accessory dwelling unit at my house that would be something that I could potentially rent out or have my parents use in the future. And I've actually gotten now talked in by Tacoma staff into volunteering on a board to help review the projects that are coming through their pilot program. And when I saw the guidelines that had been created, I thought some of these tools may be something that we are interested in pursuing. And so the mayor had just asked that I share this with the committee and see what level of interest there may be in pursuing some of these tools sometime in the next year, and most likely after we complete our Unified Development Code, which I think is going to take the bulk of our time for the next few months. Essentially, the city is is really testing out regulations to allow detached accessory dwelling units, duplexes, multifamily housing in single-family areas, and a cottage housing type program. And I think their big concern is if they just adopt the regulations and allow this thing to come in without an extra level of scrutiny or without sort of metering it, you know, they're worried that people will react negatively to it. And so they want to actually have people apply and screen the projects before they allow anything like this to go forward. And so for each of the Tacoma neighborhoods, they've allocated a certain number of units, and they're looking for people to do a project here and a project there, and they're going to score them and basically award the rights to build projects under these regulations in certain areas and then see how they perform over a period of time. I don't know that that's necessarily the approach that we want to take, or that we may be too small to run a program quite like that. But I thought that the regulations were quite good and that it was worth sharing. And specifically, I think that in the older areas of the city, especially to the north of Tremont and Lund area, in areas that were platted, closer to the 1900s than more recent subdivisions that have different lot layouts and street patterns. Some of these tools could be very useful for getting more people living in the vicinity of downtown and in areas that are served by transit. So just interested to hear your thoughts on any of these and whether any of these are something that you would like to pursue sooner rather than later.
Well, I haven't looked through this, or read through this, I should say. But on the face of it, I support the purpose of the infill program. And I think, as everybody knows, GMA essentially shoves growth down our throat, so we've got to be able to accommodate that, and this is certainly a good set of tools to look at doing that. Is there a downside?
I think that the risk is that you get somebody who puts an ugly project in that nobody likes, and then the council hears about it and is pushed to not allow further development of this type. And so really it's writing regulations in such a way that you're not going to have bad development, changing the character of the older neighborhoods in the city.
Design standards.
Yeah, which coincidentally, the company that Tacoma hired for this is the same company we selected for our design guidelines that we've been working on a scope and contract with.
Parking, perhaps.
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind is there are large lots in McCormick Woods, but most of the new development are these 5,000 square foot lots and 3,000 square foot lots, and how are you going to put another unit on it? So there's going to be limited applicability of this, because the lot's going to have to be a certain size, I would think, before you could get another structure on it.
I would assume that CCNRs could also prohibit this.
Correct.
In McCormick, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that Tacoma did was, and I've started doing this with our GIS data, is kind of mapping the city based on the era during which housing was constructed, and ours isn't as clear cut as Tacoma's, which sort of had phases of expansion.
Yeah, turn to page 22. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and so infill development works much better in some areas than others based on sort of the street grid and how things have developed over the years, and I think it's important to consider that as we figure out where these sorts of things might be allowed and maybe where we don't want to allow them, which McCormick Woods may be a place where it really doesn't fit into to what exists there today compared to, and I assume back that you have a nice rectangular lot as part of the old grid, and ADUs.
Me personally?
Yeah.
My lot's like this.
Well, yeah, but the property dimension is.
No, I'm this way, and
Oh,
I'm-
okay. I
But
assumed
this is on a hill. It's an abandoned street.
Okay. So anyway,
Yeah,
maybe this isn't urgent, and given the work that we have on the Unified Development Code, I would just encourage you to continue looking at this and thinking about how it would work.
Do we
And-
want to just carry it over to the next meeting and hope that we've had a chance to look at it
If
a
we
little
do
bit more?
something like this, I could see tiny houses going in. That's basically, I could see people putting tiny houses there, and is the intent for, for them to be rental units, or is it to care for a mom and dad that, the actual mother-in-law place? And I don't know that I care, I'm just
Right.
trying to think.
I think it's typically
I just
both.
feel like as a council, I think we have other goals right now that, until we see maybe the outside world developers coming in and asking for this, I think there's other issues that I think we want to work on, whether it's the DOD or, some of these other, areas. So, I could see this in a city like Tacoma or Seattle where it's a very urban feel, and, some of the GMA issues, but I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got, so I don't know, just from a priority standpoint, if this for me sits the top of the priority. But it's great information, and like I said, I mean, who knows? If the landscape changes, it's nice to have this as a tool and by then we might have a few samples in Tacoma that are already built, and we could look at it, touch it, feel it, and, learn from it.
One of the upsides to a program like this is affordable housing.
Mhm.
I mean, that's supposed to be one of the outcomes. What's our current ADU landscape for the city right now?
We allow them as attached dwellings, and quite honestly, our residential code, we've noticed a couple of things about it. For instance, there's no limit to the number of houses that can be put on one lot if you meet the minimum lot size.
Uh-huh.
And so if you have a large lot, you could potentially put an ADU there if your lot is big enough for 2 dwellings and doesn't require a subdivision. And so that's one thing that we've looked at, is that how we want things to operate going forward. We also currently allow attached single-family housing, which is defined in our code. We already allow that, and there's some very strange things in our setbacks, because the setbacks still say you have to have setbacks between units, but the zoning table says you're allowed to have attached housing. And so, there's some cleaning up to do to make some of the things that we already have work a little better, maybe, but
Which we're proposing to do through the code update we've got
correct.
on the table right now.
Well, we're not going into the zoning table right now, but we propose to do it once we put in place the architecture for
Okay.
moving our zoning code and design guidelines forward.
So we don't allow detached ADUs then?
Not unless you have enough lot area for a second dwelling.
Okay. What are your thoughts?
I don't know, I'm kind of with Sean a little bit in that I like this idea, and I would like us to have some progressive ways to meet the growth we're gonna have to take and maximize use of our current land. But I hear so many things that we have to do that I would like to get them further along to completion before we take on another.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
last night we kicked the sign code to the
Right.
after the development
Exactly.
regulations, and it's
Right.
we really have to prioritize what we can work on at any one time. So.
With the new Supreme Court ruling, I wonder how that would impact
Yeah,
some of
well,
this.
I was just-
Start trying to
I was just
change
thinking
something.
that
It might
these-
not be feasible anymore.
Each
That
one
was
of
just
these
gonna
is
stop.
gonna need water and sewer too.
Mhm.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Is it the will of the group to look at this in 6 months?
Say, look at it when the unified code is complete.
Okay.
Which maybe
Yeah.
less than 6 months, but
There you go.
Okay.
Perfect.
And maybe even just introduce it to everyone else at our retreat.
yeah, I think the
Yeah.
retreat is a good place to have
Yeah.
a discussion for.
Exactly. As
Yeah.
we continue to prioritize some of the goals and visions, then we'll see where but this is great, like I said, great information. But I don't know if this would be number 1 on our priority list.
When is the retreat?
February.
March
April.
24th.
March
Oh,
24th,
March.
that's right. We booted it way back.
Yeah.
It's a Friday.
Friday.
Okay.
Right. Okay. All right, and I had asked for just an update on item number 3, with the idea, in perhaps my mind alone, that zoning changes in the overlay district, downtown overlay district, might spur some development. And so with the following thought, that maybe we should look at moving on that a little bit quicker.
Well,
But
so the Economic Development Committee has been discussing the downtown overlay district, and we've mostly been just exploring, what uses currently exist and what is their zoning, and also kind of unpacking the layers of zoning that exist through the downtown overlay district, which include height depending on which side of the street you're on. It includes, I think there's 6 different zones downtown, but in the central DOD, those zones are actually superseded by a list of uses that are in the DOD regulations, and it depends whether you're on Bay Street or not, which uses are included. And so we're really looking at things on a parcel by parcel level to figure out what makes sense long term. And I think a perfect example is the Marley Apartments, which right now, and I don't have the map in front of me, I believe is zoned, is it commercial? Marley Apartments are zoned commercial. The entire property is almost all within the shoreline management area. And under the change we made to our shoreline master program, they can use the same footprint, but they can't expand the footprint. But it occurred to me, why, are we really wanting this to cease to become multifamily at some point, or would we want to allow it as multifamily and say, if you want to remodel this building and take it up another floor, should they be allowed or encouraged to do that? And it seems odd that that property is zoned commercial, because tearing that building down and starting over in the footprint that you're dealing with is not, really the only thing you're going to see is a modification to that building rather than demolition and reconstruction, I think. And I don't know if I'm shooting from the hip here on explaining this, so Carrie, if you have anything.
I'm just thinking about the SMP.
Yeah, and I feel like when we amended that, there's still a minimum setback from the shoreline.
Yes, you can't go any further than you are,
Yeah.
and your
that-
impacts can't increase.
Yeah, exactly. And so really, are you, looking at the footprint of the existing building, do we envision that ever being commercial, or, should we look at it differently? And then some of the houses on Kitsap here going up the hill, I think Jerry Child's house and the two that are next to it have a zoning that, do we really want those to cease to be residential and become commercial at some point? And, I'm not really sure. We only have so many houses of that vintage that are, have that sort of aesthetic, and do we want to preserve that housing stock rather than having zoning in place that's going to potentially result in its conversion or demolition at some point in the future? So really, we're just trying to dissect the downtown right now and look at and basically just try to group properties together by their common attributes, whether it's current use, potential height based on whether it's going to block somebody's view or not. And what we're finding is that there's maybe 10 or 15 different types of property in our downtown, yet we have an overlay district that has two sets of uses that are allowed in the central DOD, and heights that maybe don't make sense as much as they ought to based on their location and their topography of what surrounds them. So we're really just looking at things right now. We haven't proposed anything specific yet.
I will add, at the Economic Development Committee is, for the last, 2 months or 3 months, we start our meeting, the first 30 minutes, we've invited board members from the Port Orchard Bay Street Association and Chamber, and we've been talking about educational opportunities and how can the city facilitate that. But that group of people have stayed through the rest of the meeting. And so they have heard the discussion on the downtown overlay district and the map that Nick provided us with each individual parcel and our color crayons. That was also provided to these merchants or the business community. So we're engaging them, not necessarily in the they're not actually participating in the discussion actively, but they're listening and they are asking questions. So when we get to the point where we want to do something, there's already going to be a foundation of information among our business community.
Okay.
Yeah, and my hope for this is that once we get the uniform code in place, then I want to go to work on the zoning tables and potentially expand the number of zones. And I think the perfect example is that we have a commercial zone that exists on Bethel, and that also Bethel, between Lund and Sedgwick, and it also exists in parts of Bay Street downtown where properties have that same commercial zoning, but the streetscapes and the scale and the lot sizes are totally different, and we have sort of a one-size-fits-all zone. And so I think creating some commercial subzones and also potentially putting things like car dealers and storage units into particular commercial zones so that they are not allowed in every commercial zone, but we've really said, hey, this is where we want those types of things to be, is maybe something that ought to be considered as we go through this. But I'm thinking this is a second half of the year type of project as far as actually having a written proposal ready to go. And so that's our schedule at this point.
Okay.
And again, we can just maybe talk about that a little bit at the retreat, because I believe the zoning is a citywide conversation. And wanting redevelopment of downtown is important, and I think we all raise our hand and say we want redevelopment downtown. But that's when you have a landowner that owns, almost 2 full blocks. 1 full block, half a block, and then half a block on the other side. They're really in control right now. And we can do a lot of things, and if it,
Yeah, we even had the conversation, we said, well, look, tell us what zoning regulations you want, or hire somebody to help you figure out what's going to work in terms of getting those things redeveloped. And he doesn't even have an interest in changing anything because, it's such a low priority for him, based on how many times his phone rings with people wanting to buy or do something with that property.
So I agree with you in that we could do some changes and make it more attractive to his potential buyer. But again, on our list of priorities, where is that?
Well, I recall we were close to pulling a trigger on some zoning changes. We had a
Right.
hearing. It was impassioned by a number of people, so we pulled back on that. But I thought we were pretty close on some core agreement there. Perhaps there were some things we weren't, daycares on the ground floor, those kinds of things. But
Mhm.
Right.
otherwise, I thought we had, for the most part.
Right, what I'm remembering is, right now, it had to be retail on the bottom within the
Mhm.
central DOD, and that was the part we were pushing back on, or wanting to alter a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I have one more thing for the good of the order, and I'm going to put this on the next month's meeting agenda. But McCormick Woods, the owner has, we've been working with them because they obviously were platted in the county under county zoning. And the county zoning regulations have a certain set of setbacks, building heights, all these standards that apply to houses under those county zones. They differ from the zoning that the city has applied. And for instance, I think front and rear yard setbacks are slightly different. They've basically identified that the product type that they're looking for going forward in terms of being able to have houses with front porches that project further towards the street than the garage doors and making things look really nice. But neither the county's regulations nor the city's regulations really work for them as the lots are configured going forward. And so I said, well, if you guys can tell me what you need, I can put together a proposal and help figure out what areas should have that type of zoning. And so what the owner of McCormick Woods has proposed is a sort of an alternative R8 zoning that has slightly different setbacks and allowances for how the garage driveway orientations work. And what they're asking essentially is for the city to consider adopting a set of zoning regulations that we would legislatively change. We would legislatively amend our zoning map and create like an R8B zone, which is different than our existing R8 zone, and we would apply it in certain areas of McCormick Woods. And that way they would have uniform development throughout their next phase, their parcel B, as well as future phases of development. And so I don't think anything that they're proposing is controversial or is going to look bad, and it corresponds with a housing product type that they're looking to develop. And so they finally got me a draft of that late last week, and I've sent it to, I'm not sure, I think I've sent it to Carrie and Stephanie, and maybe I just sent it to Stephanie because she's the one who's got that project and said, hey, what do you think of this? But we're still reviewing it internally, but I wanted to let you know that it's out there and figure out how we might like to move forward on that. And I think, one thing that probably needs to happen is we need to let the HOA know that McCormick has requested some changes to the zoning.
They are the HOA though.
They haven't, it's not an independent,
No, the developer, because they haven't sold enough lots, so the developer is the HOA.
gotcha.
Are
So
they wanting to bring their habitable area out closer to the right of way? Is that what you're saying?
that's one of the changes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have a 25-foot setback and they want to go to a 20. They've
Okay.
also proposed specific architectural guidelines that would apply to the builders they sell to out there, which they've proposed to incorporate into their covenants rather than having the city adopt it. And so we separately were discussing single-family design standards, and so the question becomes, do we adopt what they're proposing into our code as a regulation, or do we take McCormick out? Or do we apply our single-family design standards accepted in McCormick, which has its own standards through its covenants, and then allow them to enforce their own regulations on the builders, to whom they sell vacant lots. But anyway, I think they're looking to start, they've got a final plat application that they hope to adopt in February. They hope that the council will approve in February, and then their home builders want to get to work on this shortly thereafter, and they would like to have these regulations in place in time to get to work on building homes.
Does that have to be done through a rezone, or could it be done through a development agreement?
Well, I think it would have to be done, I think it would essentially be like granting a variance, and I don't know that you can do that through a development agreement.
I thought a development agreement could kind of supersede or create custom, I don't know.
Maybe so, I'd have to look into that, but in any event, we have a proposal, and I'd like to bring it to you next month, and the timeline on doing something with that may be even faster than our uniform development code, as long as you're open to looking at it. So
the information we heard last night on stormwater
mhm.
and the impact that may have on developers, how will that impact our growth? And being more of a bottom line person, the permit income that we had anticipated this year? Because there's a certain amount of revenue that we expected to be generated from things, and how will that
That
impact?
is a great question, though I don't remember discussing that at the council meeting last night. I think it is, we have yet to see how it affects things, and to a large extent it depends on, how our development agreement with McCormick Woods fits into, that ruling, and we really aren't clear on that yet. Our attorneys are talking and trying to work things out.
Okay.
But,
And I've got a good of the order when you're ready.
yeah,
Some time ago, we heard testimony about some regulations, maybe it was in Vancouver, where landowners or commercial landowners are penalized for vacancies. And I think I had mentioned, what would that look like for us? Not that we want to go there, and it could be controversial. But I'm wondering if we have that as a tool in our toolbox.
we have not had a chance to look into that yet. I think
Okay.
we were in the thick of writing a stormwater code that we got done at the very last hour, and then since then I've been working on this unified code, and so it is, if you would like me to put that at the top of the list, I can have that for next meeting. It's just we have a lot to sort out with the stormwater
Yeah.
things and whatnot right now that's taking a lot of time.
It's just something I was interested in. I don't know if anybody else is.
Interesting.
Maybe we should put it on the retreat discussion.
Yeah, let's do that.
Are people penalized for purposely keeping their buildings vacant, or, what do you do if it's just a bad market and you can't rent out?
I don't know.
I think it's targeting like foreign-owned vacant spaces where somebody just buys something as a holding, and they live abroad and they don't. It's just sits vacant and
So
they
you just
choose
keep a
not to
couple
rent
blocks
it.
of vacant, deteriorating property and...
Well, not even necessarily deteriorating. I think Vancouver is doing it also for just empty, unoccupied spaces that are taking up space in the city without actually having somebody in them.
It,
I
it,
think
it
that
seems like
really
it could be a
op-
tough
It
situation.
really opens up a lot of
Particularly-
other things, because then you could, which is kind of what we have in, we do have some situations downtown where landlords want to rent their buildings out. So they have created artificially low leases. And so you're getting businesses in there that may or may not be successful. I mean, we have a lot of hobbyists downtown. We have 2 buildings that the retail is only open Saturday and Sunday, you know, and is
Mhm.
that what you want? So
Right.
if you require them to be occupied, are you going to put some restrictions as to what kind of occupancy that can be?
Well, I think there has to be some sort of burden of proof of their trying not to be just a holding company. I mean, I
Right.
wouldn't penalize someone for not renting it out at 10 cents a foot, you know?
Right.
But,
Right.
you know, that they have a plan in place and they're out marketing and they're doing something, making an attempt to be something other than a holding company.
Right.
But
It'd
do
be-
you restrict who can purchase? Because originally, when those buildings were for sale with the Howe estate and with the miners wanting to liquidate, they had properties that they wanted to sell all of them. And the one buyer came forward and said, I can afford this, and he wrote checks. Now, that was a holding company. So do we want to say you can't have a holding company buy in downtown?
Well, I don't think you say that. I don't think you would want to restrict, you know, the whole fair trade, you know.
Yeah.
If you're fine, but you would just have to abide by X. I don't care if you call yourself a holding company or
Company or
whatever, but in
whatever.
our town, if you come and do this, these
This
are
is
the
what
rules and regulations that you have
regulations.
to follow, and in effect, these don't allow you to hold it for 24 months or 36, whatever
Whatever
the
it is.
structure is.
Yeah, and those are the elements that I'm most curious about
Yeah.
that Vancouver's
Right.
handling.
Right.
Yeah, I think the other thing, you know, Gary Anderson had a good point last night. I mean, when he was talking about, you know, what's happening on Bethel, he says you just need to wait a little bit longer and let the growth continue because you need that critical mass to support things. And when we talk about the infill development policy as a way to get people downtown, I mean, that's part of the equation of making that, you know, making those things viable more so than they are today. And it's, you know, to an extent, it's a waiting game, and it's
Yeah.
let's get more people into our
Right.
downtown.
And we saw that. We saw that when Walmart went in and Fred Meyer went in and Lowe's went in. You know, we had reached a population that allowed all that, and we've plateaued. And so we have now this time frame to what do we want Bethel to look like? What do we want downtown to be?
Right.
So, you triggered a thought, and now I forgot what it was. Oh, I was going to also mention, along the same lines of vacant buildings, I had an article forwarded to me that came out of, apparently the state of Ohio has banned the practice of boarding up vacant buildings because there's a new product on the market that is like a transparent polycarbonate type of window boarding material that allows you to see the windows
Inside.
rather than actually having, you know, an ugly wood particle board type of sheeting on the outside of your building. And so the state passed a law actually prohibiting the practice of boarding up buildings, and Ohio's in a different economic state than we are, and they have a lot bigger problems with boarded up buildings. But I thought it was interesting that, you know, the idea of passing regulations about how you would go about boarding up a building to keep it looking more attractive than what it otherwise could look like. And so I've had Doug and the mayor talking about that, but again,
That's interesting.
it's low on my priority list, and that stuff costs 4 times more than
You don't
plywood.
board it up, you polycarbonate it up.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I can forward the article if anybody's interested in
Sure.
it, but it was an interesting idea.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's it then.
But that is information that would be good to have. What is Vancouver doing?
Yeah.
How are they addressing that?
Yep. We can learn.